Hi, today I'm here to talk to you about cannabis concentrates. In this talk, we're going to try to cover the many different types of cannabis concentrates, some common used ways of inhalation, and also address some safety and concerns. My hope is that when we're done, if you've never had experience with them, you're going to have some information to understand if they're right for you and hopefully have some questions addressed. A little bit about myself. My name is Bryce Berryessa. I run a dispensary in Santa Cruz, California called Treehouse. I'm also the president of La Vida Verde. We're a cannabis manufacturing and edibles company that produces many different edible and refined smokable products under the brands Blank Brand, Skunk Feather, and La Vida Verde. I really fell in love with the cannabis plant in 2005 after graduating from college and moving to California to work on an organic farm. My first introduction to cannabis, is probably like most of you, was with the flower. For 5 years, I studied organic cultivation methods and sustainable agricultural practices and really just immersed myself in the amazing medicinal properties of this plant. It wasn't until working at a dispensary in 2011 that I started to notice that our providers and our patients were coming in offering or asking for concentrates. They really started to take up a huge portion of our shelf space, and in 2011 and 2012, that exploded. So, what is a concentrate? A concentrate is a form of substance which has had the majority of its base component removed. In the case of cannabis, concentrates are made up of plant oils and resin glands. These contain the highest levels of cannabinoids, including THC. So for flower, you normally do not see THC in excess of 30%. However, with concentrates now, we see concentrates that are almost pure THC, 100%. So concentrates are a significantly more potent and refined version of the psychoactive and aromatic properties that we find and love in the flower. So, a brief history. Cannabis, as you may or may not know, has been around and has interacted with humans for thousands of years. The first recorded instance of cannabis being used is in China and dates back to 6000 BC, where people there used it as a food source. The exact time, date, location, and geographic origins of cannabis as a use of textiles or for its spiritual, medicinal, or psychoactive properties is unknown, but what we do know is that it likely originated in Central Asia, and as trade routes got established, cannabis, being the wonderful plant that it is, was cultivated by humans, but also had the ability to adapt to many different climates. So, as humans traveled throughout the Asias and throughout Europe and India, cannabis traveled with it. What we find is that it is a viable and crucial part to many of these ancient cultures. Ancient Indian texts that date back to 1400 to 2000 BC talk about cannabis as a sweet grass. The god in Hindu culture, Shiva, talks about it and reveres it for its magical properties. Many cultures in India use it as a spiritual vessel to help them communicate with the divine and to find peace. So, cannabis concentrates, although they seem new and they're exciting now, they've actually been a part of many different cultures long before the time of Christ. Cannabis coming into Europe is more of a recent thing in the last few hundred years, and primarily in the form of hash. So, fast forward to the last 20 years. Something that's been around and used for centuries is now being prevalent, it's part of pop culture, and it's exploded. Why is this? Well, I attribute it to two things. One is the free and widespread systematic ability to get information via the internet. Anyone that has the access to the web can now watch a YouTube video or a tutorial on many different ways to make cannabis. They can hop on a forum and talk with other like-minded individuals, or they can watch things here like on Green Flower Media, where you can get a professional ability to learn about these things. So this has really, in the last 10 years, created this culture and this community of hobbyists that want to figure out how they take this plant and turn it into something new and exciting. The other thing is the decriminalization in the United States has really propelled cannabis concentrates forward. What this means is that although it's federally illegal, the ability to have a state legal business allows people the access to capital. Once they have capital, they can now invest in new technologies to extract botanical essences that are normally relegated to the food and pharmaceutical industries are now available to the cannabis industry. Along with that is the destigmatification of it and the ability to hire people that have been highly trained in sciences such as chemistry. And they are taking that knowledge and they're taking that technology, they're applying it to cannabis to create new medical and consumer-based goods. This has really allowed concentrates as a segment of the cannabis market to explode in the last 5 to 10 years. So, we've talked a little bit about the history. We've talked about how we've gotten here. So now let's get into the meat of it. Concentrates is a wide word. There's many different kinds, and it seems now increasingly there's more and more kinds hitting the market as the technology is expanding. We've moved out of our infancy and now we're catching our stride, and there's still so much more growth to come, but it's been really fun in the last few years to see the level of concentrates and sophistication just skyrocket. So I've broken this into 2 different categories. Cannabis 2.0 is essentially concentrates that were made by methods that kind of were around until a couple years ago. So non-solvent is going to be the traditional ones for the most part. They've been around for hundreds of years. They're part of many different cultures, and these include kief. So kief is a pretty simple concept. Most of you have heard of Moroccan hash. Moroccan hash is one of the most famous examples of kief. Essentially, cannabis plants are harvested, they're dried, they're smashed in cold weather under sieves or screens, and all of those heads and those trichome glands that contain all of the cannabinoids and all of those terpenes fall down. They're separated into a nice fine powder. Generally, this is about 30 upwards of 40% THC. That powder can be sold as is, or oftentimes it's pressed, which makes it easier to deal with, easier to transport. Hash. When you think of hash, you think of cultures like Afghanistan. You also think of cultures like India. Hash is another very simple way to create a cannabis concentrate. Traditionally, in India, the most revered form of hash is called charish. And that is taking a cannabis plant, smashing it with your hands, rubbing it, getting all of that sticky, icky goodness to accumulate, and then over the course of hours sometimes, scraping it off, letting it accumulate, rolling it into little balls, and drying. This is known in many aficionados, many connoisseurs consider charish to be the highest form of hash. Another simple way to do hash, which we find in Afghanistan and other cultures, is using carpets, textiles, or leather to smash the plants, run through the fields, and then this accumulates all of these oils. Those oils are then scraped from the carpet or the fabric or the leather, rolled in much the same way, and create a nice, very simple extraction process. Bubble hash, which many people have heard, is a modern-day take on an old technology. It's essentially using water at sub-zero temperatures and adding the plant material into it. It's agitated, all those plant glands break off with the water in the cold, much like when you're smashing it, they're breaking off with the physical movement. And then, like with kief, bubble hash uses a system of filters to filter out the trichome heads and separate it from the plant material. That is then dried, and it is then either rolled or sometimes it's sold in a powder form, much like kief. So this is old school concentrates. This is nothing new, it's not technology, but all of a sudden we have access to the internet, we have access to legalization. What happens? Well, smart people look at what other industries are doing. Hydrocarbons. I'm sure you've heard of butane, propane. This is one of the most common forms of extraction in legal states. What's done is a solvent has the capability of stripping the oils from the plant compounds. This is somewhat sophisticated machinery, although you can do it at home, which is not recommended, using some rudimentary technologies. With hydrocarbons, they are very good at getting the plant oils and the extracts out. It's usually done in a vacuum. It's done in a closed loop properly, meaning that these gases are going to be used to strip out the oils from the plant material, and then they're going to be put back into a containing vessel without exposure to the outside environment. That product, that oil, is known as a raw concentrate. It's then extracted from the machine, and because a solvent is used, has to go into further processing. Hydrocarbons are popular because post-processing with that material can produce a wide array of different textures. You can create a cannabis concentrate that doesn't have any solvents in it after it's done properly, that's going to be crumbly like angel food cake. You can create something known as shatter, which is brittle and glassy and looks like a Jolly Rancher that's been rolled out very thin and can snap. You can create something that's like cake batter. All of these are highly potent, 70% THC to up to 95% THC, and very aromatic. Other solvent extraction processes include carbon dioxide, also referred to as CO2, and ethanol. Right now in the industry, CO2 and ethanol are very efficient and very quick ways to get a crude cannabis extract. That crude extract does need to undergo further post-processing, so it's not accessible to the hobbyist or a home producer of concentrates. It can require a lot of expensive material, and generally CO2 and ethanol extracts are primarily used to be further refined, as we'll get to later, for distillate or winterized into vape pens, or also make a really phenomenal food grade oil that can be put into cannabis edibles or tinctures or concentrates. Finally, the last Cannabis 2.0 technology is a very simple one. I'm sure many of you have seen a hair straightener before. Rosin is a simple concept. You utilize heat and pressure to squeeze out the cannabinoids, and then you collect the oil. So, simple example is you take a flower or you take some keef, you put it into parchment or wax paper, you take that hair straightener, you get it to about 110 to 120 degrees, you squeeze it. What you'll find is all of those oils are going to come out. You can then collect it. Many people in the regulated market, especially in California, love this. It's a non-solvent process. They feel it's pure to the plant, and it captures a ton of terpenes because the extraction process is so short and there's no further refinement, no further post-processing. So, Cannabis 3.0. This is where you're going to need a little bit of skill. This is where the money, the science, the technology comes in, and this is really what's propelled cannabis to such an amazing state, this is really what's propelled concentrates to such an amazing state in the industry right now. Distillation is a perfect example of taking a technology from another industry and applying it to cannabis. Distillation is utilized heavily in the oil and gas industry, and it's no different with cannabis. What we do is we take a raw concentrate, much like we're going to get from ethanol or CO2. We're going to suspend it in a solvent to strip out any residual waxes and plant fats. And then that solution, once the plant fats are removed, goes into a vessel. And there's many different types of ways to do this, but the general concept is that it's going to boil under a vacuum. Everything in that raw concentrate has different components that weigh differently. They're going to evaporate differently based on their weight. The first thing in distillation that comes out is going to be the water and the terpenes. Those can be collected and reintroduced into the oil later. The next thing that's going to come out is the cannabinoids. This is the beautiful, potent, aromatic, just yummy, high-quality THC product that you're going to see when you look at a vape pen or if you look at something known as sap. So it separates, and once you are able to get that oil, it's not going to smell a lot. So you have to put the terpenes back into it to be able to get the entourage effect or be able to get it to smell like a plant. This is one of the most powerful forms of oil that we're seeing being utilized in vape cartridges. The next thing we're going to talk about is isolates. Isolates are directly taken from the pharmaceutical industry. Essentially, equipment is used to isolate whatever cannabinoid you're looking for. That raw extract is put into a machine or other part of scientific processing, and a chemical component is extruded from it. Isolates can be up to 99.9% pure THC. They can be 99.9% CBD. It is a very pharmaceutical grade product, and you see it a lot now in California, where it also has terpenes introduced back into it. Those are what give cannabis the smell and the flavor. By its own, it doesn't smell like much. Finally, for the true connoisseur, we have fresh frozen. Fresh frozen includes plant material that's harvested in the field and is directly extracted, so it's going to be much more aromatic, or it's dried for a very short period of time and then extracted. This is for the real connoisseur, and it comes in a variety of textures. So, how do we work with concentrates? Well, as most of you know, concentrates can be ingested. For this talk, we're going to talk about how you can smoke them. Common consumption methods that date back to hundreds of years are using a hash pipe. They can also be rolled into a spliff, which is very common and popular in Europe, or you can sprinkle them on top of flour. If you're a little bit more experienced, there's many different smoking apparatus that are developed to just do concentrates. These include a glass apparatus called a nectar collector, which is much like a pipe but designed for cannabis. They have different types of dab pipes or e-nails. Many of you have heard of dabbing. That's not what we're talking about. A little dab will do you, as dabs are any hydrocarbon, primarily concentrate. They're very potent. Generally how those are consumed is you'd heat up a titanium or a quartzite nail to red hot temperatures. You'll take a little tool, you'll get your different consistency of concentrate, and just a little tiny bit drops onto that heated up nail or titanium element. That's going to immediately vaporize. Generally you'll suck that through water and get a nice hit. This is not for the beginner or the faint of heart, but it is a very, very effective way to consume a lot of cannabinoids in a very short duration of time. And finally, I think what's really propelled concentrates in the last few years to the popularity that they have is the advent of the e-cigarette market and taking that technology and applying it to cannabis. Vaporizers, most of you have heard of, but essentially you can contain an oil, it heats up with a battery, fits in your pocket, is convenient, is discreet, and is a really clean and efficient way to consume a cannabis concentrate. So, we've talked about a lot so far, and you're probably asking yourself, is this for me? It may or may not be. One interesting thing that we found this year in 2018, the first quarter of all legal cannabis sales, 30% of those include concentrates. That's just concentrates that are meant to be inhaled. It doesn't include what goes into edibles, doesn't include what goes into tinctures or capsules. So, as you can see, it's a pretty staggering size of the market. So if you have concerns, safety is always a concern. With concentrates that are done in a regulated environment, they're safe. They're tested for heavy metals. They're done in a lab that has best management practices, that has oversight, staff has proper training. The material that's being extracted has been tested for pesticides and a variety of fungal, bacterial issues. So, if you're getting it from a licensed retailer or a delivery service, they're pretty safe. Cautions and concerns, they're concentrates. It's a concentrated version of anything. So much like if you drink grape juice, you're going to have an experience different than if you're drinking wine, than if you're drinking cognac. So as you dive into the world of weed, understand this. Much like with edibles, it's important to start low and go slow, know what your dose is, know what your tolerance is, and not overdo it. The other concern is that it is a refined product. So you just want to always be comfortable. You want to know yourself and know your environment. The one thing that can help if you overconsume is to have a little bit of CBD on hand. You can vaporize it or you can eat it, and oftentimes that'll help bring you back and take the edge off a little bit. So I hope this answers some of your questions. Thank you for having me, and it's been fun.